This is One Sentence News, a daily podcast featuring 3 news stories with a sentence-long summary and 1 sentence of context apiece. I'm Colin Wright. It's Tuesday, February 8th, 2022. Let's talk about the news. From France 24, UN praises positive talks with Yemen's sides on aging oil tanker. There's a fuel tanker filled with something like 1.1 million barrels of crude oil that's been sitting in the Red Sea, abandoned, rusting and without power or a functioning fire suppression system, while also leaking gases and liquids into coastal waters for years, since 2017. An ongoing civil war within Yemen, off whose coast this ship is stranded, has kept anyone from taking responsibility for or doing anything about what's increasingly thought of as an ecological disaster waiting to happen, if not a giant bomb waiting to go off. A UN official tasked with humanitarian efforts in Yemen has said recent talks on the matter of this ship were constructive. This is positive news, as it's thought this ship, if it ruptures or explodes, releasing the fuel it contains into those coastal waters, would result in about 8 million people losing access to running water and a swath of the country's fishing stock being depleted within weeks. It would also block ports that are vital to bringing food aid into the country, in addition to the countless environmental consequences of dumping more than 1 million barrels of crude oil into the sea. The UN is trying to organize members of the official Yemeni government and the Houthi rebels in the northern part of the country, the 2 groups both backed by other international interests that are at war with each other, alongside a slew of other countries that might be willing to contribute resources and volunteers to the cause of pumping the oil from this vessel, and then figuring out how to safely tow it away before it can cause any more damage to an area that's already suffering a whole lot due to the war that's been ongoing there since 2014. From the Wall Street Journal, Delta seeks to put unruly passengers on no-fly list. The chief executive of American passenger airline company Delta has written a letter to the Justice Department in which he said there should be zero tolerance for any behavior that negatively impacts flight safety and requested that anyone convicted of causing such a disruption should be put on a national no-fly list. Although such instances are still relatively uncommon, the rate of unruly passenger events that go on to impact flights, in some cases resulting in the flight having to make an emergency landing because of belligerent, threatening, and sometimes violent passengers, often upset about pandemic-related rules, like having to wear masks, but not always, has nearly doubled since 2019, and although Delta already keeps its own internal no-fly list that has about 1,900 people on it thus far, and other airlines no doubt have similar lists, this letter requests that folks who refuse to obey the rules while in flight should be banned from flying in general, as they pose a risk to everyone else aboard these planes. And from the Washington Post, Canadian police make arrests amid Freedom Convoy protests and seize fuel and vehicles. A series of protests that began in downtown Ottawa a few weeks ago, and which have since expanded to block streets and highways, and have been connected to confirmed or alleged thefts, hate crimes, and destruction of property, have resulted in 60 new criminal investigations, at least 7 arrests, hundreds of tickets issued by police, and the seizure of multiple vehicles and a stockpile of petroleum used by the protesters to keep their massive cargo trucks, which have been used to block streets and make noise for the duration of these protests, fueled up. These protests were ostensibly originally aimed at a cross-border vaccine mandate that will require truckers entering Canada from the U.S., including Canadian truckers, to be vaccinated or face a 14-day quarantine upon their return, though they've since gone on to demand other things as well, like that the current Canadian government step down. The government has said that almost 90% of Canadian truckers are vaccinated, so this group protesting is a very vocal but small minority of the industry. and most external assessments of the protests note that the loudest and most ardent members of this quote-unquote freedom convoy seem to have political motivations, which is true of most protests, but the implication is that this is a fake grassroots or astroturfed protest, despite its leaders claiming otherwise. That said, there's already some indication that similar protests, utilizing long-haul cargo trucks as a means of blocking roads and highways, might be in the works for other cities across Canada and the US in the near future. If you're finding some value in One Sentence News, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your podcasts and/or sharing the show with a friend. You can find out more about this show or subscribe to the email version at onesentencenews.com, and you can support this and other related projects, like the Let's Know Things and Brain Lenses podcasts, at understandery.com.